Father Elias stood frozen, his eyes scanning the fragile parchment in front of him. The words, written in flowing Aramaic script, spoke of a wisdom that had been hidden from the world. If this manuscript was real, then history itself had been altered. A deep voice behind him broke the silence. "You should not be here." Elias turned sharply, his heart pounding. Standing in the doorway of the underground chamber was Abbot Raphael, the head of the monastery. His face was partially hidden by the flickering candlelight, but his eyes held a warning. "Where did this come from?" Elias asked, holding up the manuscript. The abbot stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "It has been here for centuries, passed down through those sworn to protect it." Elias's fingers tightened around the parchment. "Then why keep it hidden?" A long silence. Then, the abbot sighed, "Because the world is not ready for the truth." Elias frowned. "What truth?" The abbot's voice dropped to a whisper. "That the teachings of Jesus were more radical than we were led to believe. That his words held power beyond what the church wished to share. And that if these words were revealed," his gaze darkened, "they would shake the foundations of faith itself." Elias's mind reeled. Had the church truly suppressed part of Jesus' message? And if so, what were they so afraid of? The words that could change everything. Determined, Elias turned back to the manuscript and read aloud. "The kingdom of God is not of temples built by hands, nor of priests who claim dominion. It is within you, waiting to be known." He paused, his heart racing. This teaching was different. It suggested that divine connection did not require a church, a priest, or a ritual, only an awakening within. Elias looked at the abbot. "Why would this be hidden? This isn't heresy, it's liberation." The abbot's eyes held sorrow. "Because liberation is dangerous to those who hold power. A choice that cannot be undone." Elias knew he had a decision to make. If he took this knowledge beyond the monastery walls, he would become a target. But if he left it hidden, he would be no better than those who buried the truth. "I need to take this," Elias said. "People deserve to know." The abbot exhaled deeply, as if he had expected this. He reached into his robe and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. "Then you must go to Jerusalem." Elias's brow furrowed. "Jerusalem?" The abbot nodded. "There is another fragment, a second manuscript. If you wish to uncover the full truth, you must find it before others do." Elias hesitated. "Others?" The abbot's expression turned grave. "Not everyone wants these words to be found." At that moment, the distant sound of footsteps echoed through the monastery halls. The abbot's eyes flickered toward the door. "Go, now." Elias grabbed the manuscript and the notebook, shoving them into his satchel. Without another word, he disappeared into the night, unaware that he was already being followed. The desert wind howled as Father Elias made his way across the Syrian border under the cover of night. Wrapped in a tattered cloak, he clutched his satchel tightly, feeling the weight of the ancient manuscript pressed against his chest. He was alone, but he was not unseen. Somewhere in the darkness, they were watching. For 3 days, he traveled by foot and by whatever transport he could find. The abbot's words haunted him. Not everyone wants these words to be found. Who were they, and how far would they go to keep this truth buried? A meeting in the holy city. Jerusalem was alive with movement when Elias arrived. Merchants called out from crowded market stalls, and the sound of prayers echoed from the sacred sites. He made his way to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the supposed burial site of Christ. If the second manuscript existed, this was where he would find it. Inside, the air was thick with incense, the golden candlelight casting long shadows. Elias moved carefully through the labyrinth of corridors until he reached the old library, where ancient texts were kept under lock and key. A voice startled him. "You came faster than I expected." Elias turned. A woman stood at the far end of the chamber, watching him. She was tall, with dark hair pulled into a braid, and her piercing green eyes held a quiet intensity. "Who are you?" Elias asked cautiously. The woman took a step forward. "My name is Miriam Halevi. I am a historian, and I know what you're looking for." Elias's breath caught. "You know about the manuscript?" Miriam nodded. "I've spent years searching for it. But you bring something even more valuable." She gestured to his satchel. Elias hesitated, then unfastened the bag and carefully withdrew the parchment. Miriam's eyes widened as she took in the Aramaic script. "It's real," she whispered. "I thought it was just a myth." Elias studied her warily. "If you've searched for this, then you know the danger we're in." Miriam exhaled. more than you realize. She turned, motioning for him to follow. Come, we don't have much time. The keepers of silence. Miriam led Elias through a hidden passage beneath the church, their footsteps echoing against the ancient stones. Who are we running from? Elias finally asked. Miriam's voice was grim. A secret order, the keepers of silence. For centuries, they have destroyed anything that challenges the church's authority. Elias's stomach tightened. So they know about the manuscript? Miriam nodded. And now, they know about you. A chill ran down Elias's spine. As they reached the far end of the passage, Miriam stopped in front of a heavy wooden door. She pulled out a rusted key and turned the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit chamber. And at the center of the room, resting atop an altar of stone, a second manuscript. Elias stepped forward, his pulse quickening. This was it. But as his fingers brushed the parchment, a voice rang out, "Step away from the manuscript." Elias and Miriam turned sharply. In the doorway stood three figures cloaked in black. Their faces were obscured, but the weapons in their hands were unmistakable. The keepers had found them. The chamber fell into a tense silence. The three cloaked figures stood unmoving in the doorway, their faces obscured beneath heavy hoods. One of them, taller than the others, took a step forward. His voice calm but commanding. "That manuscript does not belong to you." Elias swallowed hard. His fingers twitched, itching to grab the scroll. But something in the man's tone sent a warning through his mind. These were not ordinary men. Miriam stiffened beside him, her eyes darting between the figures and the only other exit, a narrow tunnel leading deeper underground. She was calculating, planning. Elias, however, needed answers. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady despite his racing heart. The tall figure tilted his head slightly. "We are the keepers of silence. Our duty is to protect the truth, not for men like you to distort it." Elias clenched his fists. Protect the truth? Or bury it? The man sighed, almost as if disappointed. The world does not need another truth. "Father Elias, it needs order. And this scroll," his gloved hand gestured toward the manuscript, "is a threat to that order." Miriam tensed. Elias knew she was preparing to move. They had seconds. Without hesitation, Miriam lunged, grabbing the manuscript in one swift motion. The chamber erupted into chaos. The tall figure barked an order in a language Elias didn't recognize. And the other two men moved instantly. One lunged at Miriam, trying to rip the scroll from her grasp. But she twisted away, knocking over a candle stand in the process. Flames flickered, casting wild shadows across the stone walls. Elias barely had time to react before the second man swung at him. He ducked, his instincts sharper than he had realized. He had never been a fighter, but in this moment, his survival depended on it. Miriam was already running toward the tunnel, clutching the scroll. "Elias, move," she shouted. Elias dodged another strike and followed. The keepers closed behind. The underground passage. They ran blindly through the darkness, their breaths ragged. The tunnel twisted and turned, carved from ancient stone. Elias could hear the footsteps of their pursuers echoing behind them. Miriam pulled something from her coat, a small vial. "Close your eyes," she warned. Elias obeyed. A second later, a bright flash of light exploded in the tunnel, followed by a sharp, acrid smell, a smoke bomb. The keepers coughed behind them, momentarily disoriented. It was enough. Miriam grabbed Elias's arm and pulled him forward. "We need to reach the exit before they recover." The passageway narrowed, then suddenly opened into a vast underground chamber. In the center stood a large stone altar, covered in dust and ancient markings. Miriam didn't hesitate. She ran to it, her fingers tracing the engravings. "It's here," she whispered. Elias, still catching his breath, frowned. "What is?" Miriam looked up at him, her eyes wide. The final piece of the puzzle. She unrolled the manuscript and placed it on the altar beside the markings. And then, something extraordinary happened. The revelation. The engravings on the stone began to glow. Elias stumbled back, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. The golden light traced the patterns, illuminating the symbols that had been hidden for centuries. Then, the words shifted, as if coming to life. Miriam's voice trembled as she read aloud. "He who seeks the kingdom must first seek within. For the veil is not of the heavens, but of the heart. And when the veil is lifted, the world shall know what has been hidden since the beginning." Elias felt a shiver run through him. The veil, not of the heavens, but of the heart? Miriam met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Elias, this isn't just about knowledge. It's about transformation. Elias took a step closer, his hands resting on the ancient altar. The weight of history pressed down on him. If this teaching was real, then it changed everything. It meant that God's kingdom was not something to be found in temples, churches, or religious institutions. It was something that had always been inside of us. It was a radical idea, and a dangerous one. No wonder they had tried to keep it buried. The keepers return. A low voice cut through the silence. You should not have done that. Elias and Miriam turned sharply. The keepers had recovered, and they were blocking the only exit. The tall figure stepped forward once more, his expression unreadable beneath the flickering torchlight. Now, you must make a choice. Elias glanced at Miriam, then at the glowing manuscript. The truth was in their hands, but the cost of revealing it might be greater than they could bear. The air in the underground chamber was thick with tension. The keepers of silence stood between Elias and Miriam and the only exit. The flickering torchlight cast long shadows on the stone walls, making the moment feel almost surreal. The tall leader of the keepers took another step forward, his voice calm but laced with authority. You have read the words. Now you must decide. Elias swallowed hard. His heart pounded against his ribs as he looked down at the glowing manuscript, the final revelation. The message that had been buried for centuries. It was clear now why this had been hidden. The kingdom of God was not in temples, not in rituals, not in the hands of religious leaders. It was within. It was liberation, but it was also a threat to those who built their power on control. Miriam's grip tightened around the parchment. We can't let this disappear again. The leader of the keepers sighed. This knowledge does not belong in the hands of the masses. The world is not ready. Elias met his gaze. And who decides that? The man remained silent. Miriam took a step forward. People have the right to know the truth, to seek God not through fear, but through understanding. The leader's expression did not change. And what if they destroy themselves with it? His words hung in the air. Elias felt a weight settle in his chest. Truth was powerful, but power could be dangerous. He had spent his life searching for answers. And now, as he stood at the edge of revelation, he faced an impossible choice. The keeper's temptation. The tall man gestured toward the manuscript. Come with us, Elias. You do not have to be our enemy. You can help us protect this knowledge until the world is ready. Elias hesitated. The idea was tempting. If he joined them, he could ensure the manuscript was never misused. He could keep it safe. But then he remembered the abbot's words. Liberation is dangerous to those who hold power. Elias turned to Miriam. She shook her head slightly, her expression firm. They both knew the truth. The world was never going to be ready, but that didn't mean it wasn't worthy of knowing. The escape. Elias exhaled. I'm sorry. Then, in one swift motion, he grabbed a torch from the wall and threw it toward the nearest bookshelf. Flames erupted instantly. The dry parchment and wood caught fire, the blaze spreading fast. The keepers reacted too late. Miriam lunged, knocking one of them aside as Elias grabbed the manuscript. They ran. Smoke filled the chamber, obscuring their movements. The keepers shouted behind them. But Elias and Miriam had the advantage of knowing the passageways. They darted through the tunnels, their lungs burning from the smoke, their feet barely touching the ground. Finally, they burst into the open air. The night was still, the stars glimmering above them as if the heavens themselves had been watching. Behind them, the flames consumed the underground chamber. The keepers would survive, but the hidden vault, their place of secrecy, was gone. A new beginning. They didn't stop running until they reached the outskirts of the city. Only then did they allow themselves to breathe. Miriam looked at Elias, her face illuminated by the moonlight. What now? Elias unrolled the manuscript, its words still intact. For centuries, the truth had been buried, suppressed. Now, it was in their hands. He met Miriam's gaze. Now, we share it. Miriam nodded. The world will fight back. Elias smiled, though exhaustion weighed on him. Then we'll fight harder. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, a new journey was about to begin. The lost teachings of Jesus would no longer be lost. The underground chamber burned. Flames licked the ancient stone walls, consuming the wooden shelves and parchments that had been hidden for centuries. Thick smoke curled toward the ceiling. turning the once sacred space into a tomb of knowledge. The keepers of silence were caught off guard. The fire had spread too quickly for them to react, giving Elias and Miriam just enough time to escape through the tunnels. Their footsteps pounded against the stone, hearts racing as they ran for their lives. Miriam clutched the manuscript tightly against her chest. The ancient scroll, the one containing the lost teachings of Jesus, was still intact. And now, it was free. A moment of reflection. They didn't stop running until they reached the outskirts of Jerusalem. The cool night air hit them like a wave, clearing their lungs of smoke and fear. For a long moment, neither spoke. They simply stood there, catching their breath, staring at the distant glow of the burning chamber. Miriam broke the silence first. "We did it." Elias wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands still trembling. For now, he knew better than to believe it was over. The keepers of silence would come for them. The church would condemn them. The world might even reject them. But the truth was finally in their hands. The weight of truth. Elias carefully unrolled the scroll, his fingers tracing the ancient script. The words glowed softly in the moonlight, as if whispering their power across time. He read aloud, "The kingdom of God is not built by hands, nor ruled by kings. It is within you, waiting to be known. But those who seek power shall hide this truth, for fear that the world will awaken." Miriam exhaled sharply. This is why they hid it. Elias nodded, his mind racing. If this teaching had been revealed centuries ago, the entire foundation of religious institutions might have been different. The idea that divine truth existed within every individual, without the need for a church, priests, or hierarchy, was a direct challenge to the very structure of organized faith. He understood now. The keepers weren't just protecting a manuscript. They were protecting the system that had been built around its absence. A dangerous decision. Miriam turned to him. "What now?" Elias hesitated. If they shared this knowledge with the world, it would not be welcomed. They would be branded as heretics. The church would deny the authenticity of the manuscript. The keepers would hunt them down. But if they kept it hidden, they would be no better than those who came before them. Elias looked at Miriam, then at the scroll. The world was never going to be ready. But that didn't mean it wasn't worthy. "We share it," Elias said at last. "No more secrets." Miriam studied him for a moment, then slowly nodded. "Then we must be careful. We need allies, scholars, people who will listen." Elias rolled the scroll back up, securing it inside his satchel. "And we start now. The dawn of a new truth." The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting golden rays across the city. Elias and Miriam walked toward the rising sun, carrying the truth that had been hidden for centuries. Somewhere in the distance, the echoes of history whispered. The lost teachings of Jesus were lost no more.